you are at all aware of the first people to pioneer cannabis media, then you're probably familiar with today's guest. David Bienenstock is on this episode of the Chillinois Podcast. If you're not on Patreon, then you're watching this episode of the Chillinois Podcast at least 2 weeks late. We release new episodes of the Chillinois Podcast every Sunday, exclusively on Patreon. For only $3 a month, you can get exclusive access to new episodes of the Chillinois Podcast, backstage content, and more. Go to chillinois.net/Patreon for early access to new episodes of the Chillinois Podcast and to help support the Chillinois Podcast. Enjoy the episode. David, welcome to the Chillinois Podcast. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Sweet. Are you wake and baking this morning? Are you gonna join me? I got my cereal bowl full of greens.
This looks like I already started, but this is actually leftover from last night.
Hell
you
yeah.
know, if you judge me for that, you got the wrong person. But I am down to get lit with you, so let's do that.
Sweet. Yeah, let's spark up, and then I'll have you introduce yourself to my audience. So cheers.
Cheers. My name's David Bienenstock. I'm Bean on the podcast, which is Great Moments in Weed History. We've been doing that show, Abdullah Saeed and I, for about 4 years. We met while working on the Vice show Bon Appetit, which was, as you might imagine, about food and cannabis. He was the host and I was a producer, so setting up the episodes. And I've been, as a journalist, covering cannabis for... I am almost loath to say about 20 years, which in weed years feels like a long, long time. As a shorthand, I started out getting in the trunks of people's cars to go see their grows so that I couldn't be compelled to testify against them. And now I occasionally go to business conferences full of capitalistic D-bags. So it's really been, quite a transitional period. And what we do on Great Moments in Weed History is really look at 10,000 years of cannabis-human interaction. We try to focus, as the title strongly implies, on great moments because we want people to celebrate this culture. But sometimes, of course, those great moments are about overcoming adversity, oppression, racism, all of these things that, have been thrown at the cannabis community over the years and decades and really millennia.
What a transition. I mean, going from literally being forced into people's trunks.
Not forced.
Sorry.
Consensual trunk entry. But the deal was you can come and see our plants if, you're willing to do this. So.
Thank you for clarifying, because that did sound a lot darker than I meant it to sound.
I mean, anytime you're riding in the trunk of a car, a thought does occur to you, is this a good idea? But
I'm sure.
So far, I'm all good.
I'm sure. Well, what I was going to say is the transition from hiding in people's trunks to openly talking about it on a podcast and posting about it. I mean, right out in the open, like you say, these business conferences that are advertised publicly and suits show up, and what a transition.
Yeah, I will leave your listeners to guess which one is more fun.
Yeah. I can guess. I've got a good guess on that. So, well, cool. Yeah, I like I was saying before we hopped on air, I think that a lot of my guests will be aware of who you are with your work on Bon Appetit, and then you were also working with High Times for a while, correct? Or do you still?
Back when they were cool. I don't fuck with them in their current iteration. So I guess to give you a shorthand, my first weed job was, buying an ounce and breaking it down into eighths like a lot of people. Definitely a job. So I don't want to slice it completely off the resume. But my first on the books cannabis job was writing and editing for High Times on staff going back to 2002 in New York City. At the time, High Times was an independent publication. It still had strong links to the founder, who unfortunately passed away in the 70s, but it was a direct line of a counterculture independent publication. I would say, I'm not here to like plug, but we have a 2-part episode of Great Moments in Weed History about the founder of High Times, somebody I find incredibly inspirational and whose story has not really been told much. He was a cannabis smuggler. He was a radical political activist. He obviously founded High Times, but was also a big part of what was then known as the underground press movement. So, one of my favorite episodes, somebody who unfortunately passed away before I started working at High Times by decades. I'm not that old, but, it was an honor and a real thrill and just such a unique opportunity to report on cannabis culture at a time when, everybody who was doing that all worked at High Times. There were no other real, I don't want to belittle a couple other publications, but it was a very, very small world. And I was already fascinated by this plant. But when I took that job, I had seen one plant growing in my entire life. I grew up in New Jersey. I kind of suspected that all the strains were just made up, and it was a tremendous education for me, and not just in weed, but in everything that weed intersects with. So learning about medicine and human biology through the medicinal properties of the plant, learning about the so-called criminal justice system, by seeing how oppressive and really just full of shit it is. The incredible inequalities, learning about the media through the media's failures and willingness or, unwillingness to push back against this propaganda. On and on down the line. So, and on the positive side, how cannabis is a creative tool for so many artists, comedians, writers, anybody in the creative arts. Not everybody in the creative arts, but many, many people. So, 20 years later, what keeps it fascinating for me is, I love weed. I love to smoke weed. I love to get high. I'm interested in all the different strains, but the difference between, somebody told me early on, the difference between some and none is vastly different, vastly bigger than the difference between this and that. So I'm really looking at this as a culture, as a grassroots political movement, and as a wedge into some of these other inequalities that society perpetuates. And I think if we can look at the progress that's been made with cannabis and understand how that progress has been made, then we have a chance to apply those same principles in other areas.
Very well said. Very well said. Can I ask you, and feel free if you need me to rephrase this question, I'm having trouble wording it, so I'd be happy to rephrase it. But when did you start to feel like this was a stable job? Because I have to imagine that for a little while you couldn't make heads or tails of whether we were going to legalize or not. Sure, all of us advocates have always felt that it was inevitable, but did you ever worry about the stability of like that job in and of itself?
I'll say this: I have, mainly I've worked in media, whether it was at High Times, whether it was working with Vice on Bon Appetit and as a columnist, even, I've never felt that I had job security in any sense, and I was always right. The media, it's another topic for another time, but the state of journalism, if you know a journalist in your life, send them some weed or take about, it's been a very, very tough time. So I've never had any illusion. And, what's interesting is going back that far, people would say to me, I lived in New York City where High Times was located at the time. And I had a lot of friends who just worked at other publications, and you'd hear a lot, oh man, why would you, people you're smoking a joint with. Hey man, working at High Times, you're really, you're going to have a hard time getting a job anywhere else. People aren't going to take you seriously. And this was well-meaning advice from people who liked weed. And my feeling was always, I can't really take a publication seriously if they haven't figured out that weed should be legal, or if they want to discriminate against me for telling the truth. So in that sense, there was a sense of painting myself into a corner a bit, but I never really wanted to participate in the corporate part of the media where you can't tell the truth, essentially. And I'm not a big, I believe my own set of conspiracies, the ones that have evidence for them. I'm not, I don't want people to misunderstand when I talk about the downsides and the failings of the corporate media to think I'm aligning myself with people on the hard right or whatever. I'm just saying, what you see in the New York Times and on CBS Evening News is reflective of a kind of reality, but it is not the entirety of reality. And their reporting on weed and specifically on the war on drugs in general has just been a prism to understand the way that these systems are self-reinforcing. I on the Chillinois podcast, I feel I don't have to go through point by point and debunk cannabis prohibition. But all of those things are obviously true. And what was interesting is, I wrote about this in one of my books, as legalization really became the hot topic and the poll numbers jumped and everybody was kind of jumping on the bandwagon, there was a couple of articles that were written about High Times, and they were after shitting on us and clowning on us for decades, long predating my time there were all these think pieces that are what foresighted geniuses High Times turned out to be. And it's no, it was fucking obvious. You were either lying or stupid or going along with what the power structure wanted in order to maintain access to power. So we can't, as much as I would like to think of my colleagues there and myself as, cracking the code, that a plant with no lethal dose and incredible medicinal properties, that's far safer than alcohol, which I have nothing against, should be legal, and that we shouldn't put human beings in cages over it, and that if you look at the arrest rates and it's 5 to 8 times for people of color, that's wrong. These are not the musings of a rare genius. These were obvious facts. And so that's really informed how I look at politics, how I look at the media, certainly how I look at the government and the criminal justice system.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, that is exactly what I was looking for in that question. And it's interesting to look back because you explained it. I don't mean to make you feel old, but you've been working in cannabis for almost the entirety of my lifespan. I was a baby when you started. I didn't have any concept.
I didn't sell any weed to you when you were a baby. I don't want to.
No, you didn't.
I might have been breaking those ounces down, but I was selling them responsibly.
Yeah. So I mean, I bring that up because I wondered as an adult growing up in that time period, if it did feel inevitable, and you just painted that picture, like you knew that this was inevitable. It was just a matter of time. And I always kind of wondered if like you and Abdullah and Rai, because I've had all three of you on here, like having watched Bong Appetit and having watched you guys pop up in the cannabis media landscape, I wondered if at that time you guys were like, yeah, this is in the bag now. Like you finally felt stable, or if you always felt it was an inevitable thing. So that's really cool to hear from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say by the time I started working in cannabis professionally, even then I would never use the word inevitable. And I wouldn't say that the rights that we've won now couldn't be taken away from us. And we can look at other things that are going on in this country right now and
Yes.
understand that, the law is what happens. It's not justice.
Right.
The law is, what happens in the world. And so, not only is it not inevitable, it could be taken away. But I will say this, by the time I started working at High Times, Prop 215 had been implemented for 5 or 6 years. But, and here's another episode of Great Moments in Weed History, right after I took that job, the federal government sent 30 armed DEA agents to raid a place called Wham, which was supplying free cannabis to the terminally ill, a lot of people with HIV/AIDS, but also people with cancer who could not afford it. So you had some dispensaries opened at the time. It was very expensive. Here's a group that's growing cannabis, bringing people in to grow collectively, giving it away, and they're raided and held at gunpoint. These are people who have, some of them have become, among my closest friends because I eventually lived in the same town with them and would volunteer at the garden. Shout out to Mike and Valerie Corral and everybody at Wham. I would say if you want, maybe, certainly very personal episode to me, but I really think one of the most moving episodes of Great Moments in Weed History is called Wham Takes Down the DEA. And you can see that even that late in the game, the entire state of California had voted to protect exactly this. And really the reason the DEA targeted Wham is not because they thought they were doing something outside of state law, but because they thought they were the best example of compassionate cannabis. So why do you send 30 armed government jackbooted thugs up to a remote weed garden to put a gun to the back of the heads of literally one woman in a wheelchair? Because you think they're the best example of it, and if you can intimidate them, well, then everyone else will understand, oh, okay. It's like pulling somebody over for doing 55.1 miles an hour and then holding a press conference. The message is supposed to be, it doesn't matter what you do. And so that was a real turning point. Wham fought back. They brought thousands of people out in the street. They gave away cannabis on the steps of City Hall in Santa Cruz, California. Within weeks of that DEA raid, they sued the federal government and won an injunction. And that, in essence, stopped what was, at that time, a concerted plan by the George W. Bush administration to, in essence, use federal enforcement to crush California's legal cannabis system. So, and that was, like, as I said, within my first few months of working at High Times. So, one message from just an older dude hanging around is like, don't take anything for fucking granted, and don't underestimate these people who are outwardly saying they want to create a fascist state in this country. That is what they want. And the drug war, the war on drugs, has been their pilot program for fascism. kicking down people's doors in the middle of the night over a small amount of beneficial plant matter
Yeah.
sends a very specific message. The message is, fuck you, you have no rights, and armed agents of the state will do whatever the fuck they want on any pretext. Now, we may win, or we may be winning when it comes to the issue of weed, but the war on drugs continues largely unabated. And you know, I don't want to get too far off your topic, but that fascistic impulse that has underpinned this war on drugs, they want to extend it to everything and everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point, I think that's actually a good transition into one of the main things I wanted to speak to you about today, which is I felt recently that there's been a resurgence in reefer madness. And by that, I mean, well, we'll put a link to, first of all, everything you've discussed so far, each weed episode, Great Moments in Weed History episode that you've referenced. So for folks that are listening and want to check that out, links will be in the podcast description. We'll also have a link to your book. I wanted to talk about the recent resurgence in reefer madness because I actually saw you in the past go on to Fox News and take Tucker Carlson on. I think it'd be interesting to talk about that specific interaction, but I think it's more prudent to talk about what we've seen recently come up, which is a lot of conversation about THC potency and whether or not we should limit THC potency. And some have even gone so far as to say that THC potency is to blame for the recent spike in mass shootings and everything else. David, please, what are your thoughts on this particular topic?
Absolutely. I do want to slide in. I feel like I got a little. You caught me in the coffee hour when I'm most worked up. So I just want to mention we also have really just fun episodes. I'll just say our first episode of Great Moments in Weed History was Willie Nelson smoked a joint on the roof of the White House, and our most recent one is about the glass blower Bob Snodgrass, who kind of created the heady glass movement that led to all the fancy dab rigs and everything like that. So it's a fun show. We're fun, lighthearted people just enraged about the drug war.
Yes.
Okay. As far as this goes, this is what I say when I say, don't take these rights for granted. You're seeing across the right this effort to link cannabis and, in particular, these violent, mass shootings, but violence in general. There's a few reasons for that. One, I think, is they don't want to address meaningfully the underlying causes of why these mass shootings happen in the United States and largely don't happen other places where access to guns is reasonably restricted. So they need a scapegoat. So much of the war on drugs is about, okay, well, we want to fuck with people of color, but that's not technically legal. So how do we create a proxy? This is a little bit of that. But also, as more and more authoritarian people seek and gain power, we really have to look at something in the plant that is inherently anti-authoritarian. Not for everybody. There are some real fucking asshole people who smoke tons and tons of weed. I like to say, smoking weed is not the cure for being an asshole. It's just a good place to start. It might work. And on a more serious note, 100% for people who have underlying mental health challenges, cannabis can be a triggering incident. I have seen that. I think we do a huge disservice when we deny that, because it is true and because it can be important information for somebody to understand. Like, cannabis can treat a lot of mental health conditions, anxiety, stress among them, insomnia, PTSD as a big one. You know, the science showing that cannabis is an effective treatment for PTSD is there, and the anecdotal evidence of that in terms of large numbers of veterans. You know, I one of the great honors I've had in doing this work as a reporter is getting to sit and talk at some length with so many different kinds of people who have come to this plant for so many different reasons. And so I've met that, you know, this isn't to say that this is FDA level evidence, but I've talked with dozens and dozens and dozens of veterans with PTSD about how this plant helps them. But it could also be the triggering incident for somebody. But that doesn't mean that it is the cause of schizophrenia, as an example. For one example, you know, in my interview with Tucker Carlson, he's saying cannabis is causing this huge... cannabis is causing people to become schizophrenic. There's many reasons that that's not true. But one of them we could just look at, like, if you go back to the 40s, just as an example, like, jazz musicians are smoking a lot of weed. You know, people who work on the docks in port cities, you know, but the mass population of people are not smoking weed, and the schizophrenia level is, you know, whatever percentage of the population. Then by the 70s, you have lots and lots and lots of people smoking weed. Schizophrenia the same. Now the cannabis is much more high potency, and still, you know, the rates of schizophrenia are the same. So it's just impossible on the face of it. You know, these are not serious people. These are not people interested in helping anyone. And they're not interested in understanding the truth. They're working backwards. They've come up with the idea that this is a winning argument for them on narrow grounds. All of their other arguments about cannabis have been, you know, the other thing is pre-legalization and pre-widespread legalization. They could say, oh, if you legalize it, then this is going to happen and that's going to happen and all these terrible things are going to happen. But now, you know, as one example, we look at states that have legalized and the youth, underage use generally tends to go down. So they've got to come up with something else. I'm sorry, I got to grab my... Oh, I just got to plug this in. It's right here. Sorry.
No problem at all. No problem at all. I mean...
Okay, yeah, I think I gave you a clean cut there.
Oh, it's no worries. Anyways, like, you know, what people... what I think, to your point, if potency is their concern, wouldn't you then want it to be regulated so that you could keep track of potency?
Yeah, I mean, you can't give them any... That's the thing. It's not an exchange of ideas. It's not a debate on the merits. So, you know, and it's like, okay, well, you had almost 100 years to stop us from growing and distributing cannabis through tens, hundreds of millions of arrests, by creating this fucking police state. You know, you certainly gave it a good try. So let's accept that people are going to grow, buy, and sell cannabis. Can you honestly tell me that a completely unregulated system, now I might like it, but why would you? You know, they're not good faith arguments. And so that can get really frustrating. But this is the other thing I could say from some experience. And when I say, like, how have we been so successful in this movement in terms of concrete change and other things look so bad? Consistency. when 16, in the 1970s, when I was born, not when I was working at High Times, everyone, less than 20% of people were in favor of legalization, Gallup poll. But there was normal. There was, a whole group of people. Along came Jack Herrer. Along came that guy that you might have met down at the arcade who gave you a flyer. You know what I mean? Like, we were there as a movement pushing this issue even when it was extremely unpopular. 2, weed is fucking amazing. It can stop your aunt from puking her guts out while going through chemotherapy. It can stop your son or daughter from having severe seizures hundreds of times a month. So, we got to give it up to weed a little bit. But the other thing is, like, not allowing the debate to be defined by people who are full of shit. And, when we get into things in the two-party system, it often becomes, there's two sides. There's two sides. There's not two sides of weed legalization as an issue. There's a reasonable science-based examination of the issue, and then there's nonsense like you'll hear Tucker Carlson spewing in your ear when you're sitting there trying to speak to people. So in some sense, you have to speak past them. When I sat down for that interview, I don't have any illusions that I'm going to present some facts and Tucker Carlson is going to go, oh, whoa, holy shit. Didn't realize that. I guess you're right. Or I guess I need to learn more. That's not within the realm of possibility, but to the unfortunately millions and millions of people who listen to that guy every night, that's who you have to speak to. And what's interesting about weed is some of the most, conservative, to use a nice word, people, they know, they smoke weed, they like it, it's helped their aunt through chemo, so I got tons of emails and messages and the YouTube comments, which I'm a don't read the comment guy in general. So many of them were, I love you, Tucker, but you don't know what you're talking about this. And my only, note back is like, thanks. And this ain't the only thing he don't know shit about. And so, that's a real opportunity, an opportunity to use cannabis as a prism for people who, I grew up middle class, white dude, and you know what I mean? Like, I could see the injustice in the world, but the first time the injustice of the world entered my personal life was through weed. And I was very young. You know what I mean? Like, and we need to, even as it becomes legal, and people, thankfully, of your generation, depending on where they live, may grow up in that new paradigm, just to sit and think for a minute. We live in a world that has waged almost 100-year war against a beneficial plant. Something's more deeply wrong. You know what I mean? That's not the disease, that's a symptom. And so, especially what, to some extent, our audience on Great Moments in Weed History, your audience, I would imagine, as I said, are people who don't need to be convinced that weed should be legal or that weed can be beneficial, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So some of the responsibility is and history is great for that. History in general is a great way to understand our own times, the forces that we're up against, and what has been successful in the past in pushing back against some of this.
I'm so glad I invited you on because your perspective is just golden on this, man, and it's really valuable for me. And I can only imagine that people that are listening right now that it's valuable to them because yeah, that's just super powerful. And I was going to ask you about your take on Tucker Carlson, and I like on how you even approached that, you know. And I like what you said, which is like you were talking through him. You were using him and cannabis as a prism to open people's eyes, and it kind of goes back to the thing you said at the very beginning of the podcast. Cannabis isn't a surefire way to make you a great person, but it might be like step one of becoming not an asshole. You know.
Yeah, I think they're really linked. And I want to say personally, that was my experience. And something I've written about. I grew up with a really big chip on my shoulder. I had a hard time relating to other people. And I would just say, and alcohol culture, was is not the cure for being an asshole. Neither is weed, but that's not the world that's really going to take a angry, dissociated young person and help them out. But those early experiences of getting high on a personal level just helped me really, if I could, I'd say, help me laugh at myself, and that was a profound experience that changed the way I saw the world. And then also from then on, and long before it was a job, cannabis people are, same caveat, there's terrible people that you will encounter who buy, sell, and consume cannabis, of course. But at every party I've ever gone to, the part of the party where people are smoking weed, I find the most interesting part of the party. At every job I've ever had, the little group of people who would get together to smoke weed sometimes, you know what I mean? And of course, as a job, it's, much extended, but part of being a subculture. And something that, I am a little, there's so many terrible parts of prohibition, but one of the good parts of it, not good parts of prohibition, but something positive that comes out of being marginalized is this sense of mutual support, this sense of camaraderie, this sense of creating a culture with its own values. And so what we don't want to happen with legalization is for the values of corporate America, and this is in the business sense, but also in the cultural sense, to be imposed upon us. We have values to share with them. And when we look at, corporate cannabis in its current state of burning through money. They've figured out how to lose shitloads of money selling weed. The culture that they create is without merit almost always. And if you've been, around some of these people, they can be some real D-bags. And like the door is open, I think, for people who love this plant, care about this community, and want to contribute. But the way corporate America views everything is to extract. And now we, of course, have a lot of people who love extracts in terms of, getting ripped on dabs. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is extraction of market share, extraction of cultural spaces that they take away. They don't add. And so, if whether you live in Illinois or elsewhere with legal cannabis, think carefully about where your weed dollars go. It's worth it to support good dispensaries and particularly growers that you want to see exist, even if it costs a little more. And, hype is just bullshit in general. But it's like, if three sodas have three celebrity spokespeople telling you how great they are, it's just sugar water, man. It doesn't. None of them are good. And that's your choice to, drink whatever soda you want for whatever reason you want. I'm just saying it doesn't really fucking matter to me. This matters. Weed matters. Where you buy it and who grew it and how they grew it. We have a whole group of people in this country who are struggling, who have been the ones who kept it going for decades. And particularly when and if and when we start to see interstate commerce, and you can really seek out people, from up in the hills of Humboldt County, California, second and third generation growers, unique genetics who, kept it going during the worst of the war on drugs. If nobody had broken the law to grow weed, the laws never would have changed, because we wouldn't have known what we were missing. There would have been nothing to fight for. And so, just to see these carpetbaggers, these people come in who had no role in that struggle, who have no love for this culture, who have no understanding of this plant, and not only want to make money, they want to make a killing and take over everything and extract every bit of value they can and contribute nothing. Well, that's what you're supporting if you buy their weed. And it doesn't matter how cool of a logo they have or who is their celebrity person out there. Look under the hood and vote with your dollars for good human weed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the biggest thing, you've already commented on the corporatization of cannabis. This is a topic I wanted to close on. It's a big one. Like you say, vote with your weed dollars. But in states like Illinois, people have essentially been taken off the ballot. If let's just use the analogy, and I'm stealing this analogy from Box Brown out of Philadelphia, so credit to him. It's a beautiful analogy. Like, we want to vote with our weed dollars, but Illinois particularly, and many other states that you might be familiar with, these limited license states have done regulatory capture, what people call, of the industry. And so that's another example of you saying, earlier you said, don't take things for granted. Like, here are people that are arguing for legalization, but they're arguing against the right to grow at home because they say it's unsafe. It's like, what? And they're arguing against, basically allowing more small business owners to acquire a license. They've made these licensing structures so hard to get into. And one of the things that Abdullah said in our last podcast was like, something like this, you guys, we all agree, might even be inevitable for the cannabis industry, unfortunately. And if people are listening to the podcast instead of watching right now, I'm showing the 10 companies that control the food industry. And then we, of course, have 6 companies that own the media: AT&T, CBS, Comcast, Disney, News Corp, and Viacom. I'd hate to see the cannabis industry go that way, but I'll stop rambling and ask my question. Can you expound upon your take on kind of where cannabis is today and where it's headed? Like, what's your outlook on it? You've kind of given us some things, and I just, went on my little rant based off of that. But yeah, I'm curious to hear more on your take on the current state of cannabis.
Absolutely. Gonna just remind everybody, Great Moments in Weed History is fun and humorous, and we get on our soapboxes, but if you want me to spit some fire, I'll close it out, because I feel it inside. Like, that chart is terrifying, and it is a potential future, but there's a lot of reasons that does not have to be. Cannabis is unique in that there is decades of tradition in this marketplace, and we should be so proud of it. with no institutional support, with the war on drugs, weed got better. Underground weed is for what you get and the risk people are taking. It's pretty reasonably fucking priced. I of course think that it should be in a legally regulated system to ensure its purity and its potency. But outside of that system, incidents were pretty rare. You know what I mean? For the vast amount of cannabis that was grown and sold in that way. So if you live in a state that has not legalized yet, let's start there. One, you should be working towards your own liberation. If this is important enough for you to be listening to this podcast, you need to do concrete things. Join, and you don't have to do it yourself. Join with existing activism organizations where you live. And the question can't be, should we legalize? Among reasonable people, that has been decided, and the answer is yes. The question of our times is, how do we regulate it? And unless you are at the table with the decision makers and pushing back, you're going to have to push it back against people in the government who don't even want it legal. And you're going to have to push back against people who want it to be legal in this insider's game way, regulatory capture, oligarchy. Just these already rich people should be able to make money, and maybe we'll create a social justice program, but underfund it and make it so full of loopholes and bullshit that it is, do not accept that. And I'll say this. Those issues and those conversations and the amount of lobbying money, it's hard. Your best effort is to find people doing that work, unless you have some very specific skills, and support them. The very simple issue, and you put your finger on it, and the one that we as a broad-based grassroots movement should hold the line on, is if weed is legal, then I can grow it. That is an issue everyone can understand easily. It's not about the details and the loopholes and the lawyering and the back rooms and the shady deals. It's just, can I grow a plant in my backyard? Can I grow a plant on the porch, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it is also beyond the joy of growing weed yourself. It is a really important counterbalance to this type of consolidated corporate power, because great news, everybody. It's like, I live in California. I can grow 6 plants. If I'm blessed enough to have the sun and the yard, which unfortunately I personally don't right now, but I could grow 6 10-foot tall weed plants. I smoke a lot of weed. Nobody smokes that much weed,
right.
In a year, not even close. And so what that creates is an opportunity to decommodify cannabis by giving it away to your friends, or if you happen to know somebody who is ill and needs cannabis. You don't have to start a whole organization like Wham. If you just learn, if you have an abundance of weed because you were able to grow it yourself for pennies on the dollar of what it would cost to buy it in a dispensary, you can choose to grow whatever kind of cannabis you want. And also, and it's like, okay, I don't advocate people breaking the law because you can get in trouble, but everybody makes decisions for themselves. If an eighth in the dispensary is $80 because of this corporate monopolies, in essence, or oligarchies, small group of people controlling everything so they can keep the price super artificially high, but you can grow your own weed, then yeah, man, somebody's going to be at your work or at your gym or at your, pickup basketball game and say, hey, if you ever want an ounce for like $125 or something, I know where to get really good weed. And that will, in essence, fuck them. They're not going to be able to sell that vastly overpriced weed in the same market where there's ability for lots of people to grow their own. Because here's the other thing, just for our listeners to your podcast to understand. A relatively small group of people smokes most of the weed. So we have tremendous power. The people who, the soccer mom, and I love soccer moms. I love soccer. I love moms. I'm glad that they, smoke a bowl every 2 weeks.
Right.
But that don't drive the market. We drive the market. And we can refuse to participate in an unfair market. And I do think to some extent we're seeing that happen already. Look at these big the big ones, the hyper capitalized cannabis plays. They ain't doing too well, so just to get back to, if you live in a state and cannabis is legal, I'm making the air quotes, but you can't grow it yourself, there's your issue. If you live in a state that hasn't legalized yet, there's your issue. That's the most important thing, and it also happens to be, in my opinion, a basic fundamental human right.
Amen to that. God, well said. I hit you at the right time of day, David.
Yeah, coffee o'clock, huh? With a little weed chaser.
That's right. They call it the hippie speedball, right? So
They sure do.
hell yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure chatting with you today. I want to respect the time that we booked, but I wanted to just thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me. You also the reason I connected with you, I was going to connect with you anyway, but you retweeted something of mine, and it was just weird how the universe worked, because it was like, I didn't put myself as being on your radar, or even you being aware of the podcast. And so when you retweeted it, I was like, yeah, definitely got to reach out to David now, because I had literally just got done speaking with Abdullah. So folks, if you enjoyed this show, definitely check out David's podcast. As he mentioned multiple times during the show, it's usually not like we talked about a lot of serious issues today. And that's not to say that they don't do that, but the reason they call it Great Moments in Weed History is because there's been a lot of great moments in weed history. So tune in to learn more about all that. So I had to give a plug because you're in my rotation of podcasts, and I appreciate you both for making quality content. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure today.
Yeah. And any parting words before we close out? Any projects you didn't mention, or anything else that you wanted to plug or promote?
I have a book out for a few years ago called How to Smoke Pot Properly. But really, and I do a lot of reporting for Leafly. So, I am still active as a journalist for sure. But, my heart right now a lot is with Great Moments in Weed History. I really love doing that show and building a community around it. So, I'd say start there.
Cool. And specifically, how can our audience support you? Is there a Patreon for the podcast, or do you have any way that our audience could support you directly as a journalist?
Yeah, we have a Patreon for the podcast, and you can go to greatmomentsinweedhistory.com to see that. Obviously, I think listen to some episodes of the podcast and see if it's something you want to throw in on. You could put 5 on it, as we like to say, and you can also get a signed copy of my book by signing up at a higher level on the Patreon. So if you made it this far through my coffee and weed fueled diatribes, maybe you're in for a book. I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. So, well, folks, hope you found value in today's episode. I sure did. David, thank you so much once again for sitting down with me today.
Thank you.